Hi, my name is Summer Scott, and I'm going to be talking about the murder rates in Kansas City. This is something that came as quite a surprise to me, honestly, because this is the place that I was born and raised in. I have stayed here my entire life, and I've been around. I know a lot of people here, and I've always felt pretty safe here. But I did find this out recently that Kansas City has been on several lists as one of the most dangerous cities to live in, following pretty closely behind St. Louis now for a couple years. And I was really interested in finding out why this was. I didn't really get it. I haven't seen anything happen before, and I wanted to know what it was that was causing the city to be so dangerous that it was on a list as one of the most dangerous cities to live in. And I actually found out a lot of stuff, and there were three main things that I thought contributed to the murder rates in Kansas City specifically that need to be changed. And I believe that the poverty, abuse of children, and the education system are three very important things that need to be fixed for the city to become more safe. Now, first, I'm going to be discussing poverty in Kansas City. As you know, poverty is kind of inevitable with the way that our society is set up. I think that you could go most places and you would find an area of poverty. It's kind of just something that can't be avoided. And what I first wanted to discuss was demographics. There is around 360 residents in Kansas City. About a little bit over half, at 55%, are white Americans, 28% are black, 12.6% are Hispanic. And the way that it falls is that there are a mix of people that live everywhere. There are myself, I was born and raised up north in the suburbs in more of a rural area. But I found that these people living in these urban areas, in these inner city areas, are typically Black Americans. And this is something I've always known, but I was kind of interested in figuring out why this was and how this kind of was set up. I wanted to know if it was on purpose or if that's just the way the cookie crumbled. So what I found is that there's actually wage gaps. And this came as no surprise to me, honestly. I've known this for a while. I know that women typically make less than men. But I found it specifically interesting to find that in 2016, your average European American registered nurse was making a little bit over $53,000, while your average African American doing the same exact job was making a little bit under $50,000 a year. And when I read this, I wasn't shocked. I was disappointed, but I wasn't shocked. I know that this is the case. I know that that's just how the world works, and people kind of have to be okay with it. But I wanted to know why, and I wasn't really able to find out why. But what I did find is that because of these wage gaps, when you aren't making as much as someone else, you are more restricted in your way of living. You aren't able to find as nice of a place to live. You kind of have to watch your spending a lot more. And because of that, that's eventually how it ends up, that there are more African American people living in these inner city areas, whereas white people are more able to kind of choose freely where they're living. Now, also, in addition to this, I found that in these areas that are mostly populated by Black Americans, that I found recently, I don't know if it's just from me being in these areas more often now or if it's always been this way, but I found that in these neighborhoods, every couple of houses, there is one house that is just newly renovated, has brand new paint on it, it's very upkept, everything looks picture perfect, among all these other houses that are a lot more run down. And I was like, why is it like this? Like, what is it that's making it like this? And I actually found that, it's gentrification. And if you don't know what gentrification is, it's typically where you take a more run down area in a city and you fix it up, spruce it up so that it fits more to middle class Americans' liking so that they can move into these areas. And it's typically white Americans that these places are being accommodated for. And that's fun and all, but the result of it is that these people that have been living in these places, that have been populating these areas, are now not able to afford living in this area anymore, so they are kind of forced to get up, move to the next place, all to accommodate these people that just suddenly want to live here. And I think that it's really something that isn't addressed that much. I see it talked about every once in a while, but it's really kind of an issue that I don't think that is very touched on very much. And I do think that has a lot to do with, having kind of, in a way, legal segregation, because you're seeing a group of one race here and a group of another race here. But what does any of this have to do with murder rates? I actually found, doing research, I am a psych major, I found that there is a theory by a man named Robert Agnew called the strain theory. And the strain theory states that when you are faced with societal pressures, you are more likely to commit crimes. And these societal pressures could be anything from, not having as much of an education as other people, or not making as much as other people, or other factors like that. So Agnew is basically saying that when you are faced with these societal stresses of being able to afford, paying for your food or your kids or their education, you are more likely to commit crimes. And I fully stand by that. I believe that has a lot behind that. And that is a reason why there are mainly crimes being committed in these certain areas of poverty. These people are not able to support themselves in the same ways, and they feel as though they don't have any other, solution for it. Now, the second thing I wanted to talk about is child abuse in Kansas City. Child abuse is something that happens also everywhere. It's I wish it was inevitable, but there's always going to be these people around here. But what I think is important is to be able to provide children of abuse with resources so that they know that there are people around them that are good role models, and so that they have kind of an example of how they should be treated. Now, I found that there was a study that I found on serial killers, and what these two people named Mitchell and Admont, they found that of the serial killers that they had interviewed and kind of watched over for a while, they found that a majority of them had been abused in some way or form as children. It was mostly psychological abuse, followed also very closely behind by physical abuse and sexual abuse. Now, over 40% of the serial killers that were interviewed and kind of studied, they found that over 40% of them had reported being physically beaten as children. And now, something that I know just personally from being a psychology major is that I am a pretty close, strong believer of the behavioralist view, which was introduced by John B. Watson. And the behaviorist view basically says that the way that you act and the things that you believe and all this is a result of what you learned as a child. It's learned behavior, in a sense. So I believe that the reason why there are still issues of child abuse going on is because these people that are abusing their children were also abused as children. And it's actually a pretty big issue. In Kansas City, they found that 39% of reported child abuse was sexual mistreatment, followed closely behind by physical abuse, and then emotional maltreatment. And the sad thing is that a lot of abuse is actually not even reported, and that's kind of what is really sad about it, is that these children feel like, they're too scared to be able to report this stuff. And that's why I believe that there needs to be more resources in things like schools for kids to feel safe. Teachers are under a contract where they have to report if they are seeing a mark on a child or anything like that, but that doesn't account for psychological abuse or sexual abuse all the time. And I believe that there needs to be more resources in schools implemented so that these children can feel more safe reporting abuse from their parents or anyone else in their family. I think that there needs to be a lot more resources available towards children, and it shouldn't just rely on being able to see a mark for physical abuse, because there are a lot more long-term effects on abuse, not just physical abuse. And the third thing that I wanted to talk about is education. And I believe that education is kind of the key in fixing the murder rates, not just in Kansas City, but everywhere. And I believe that the last two things I talked about are very important as well. But I think that education is such an important thing to a child, true education, that really has a lot to do with how they act in the future. I personally went to a Montessori school, and I think the way that I problem solve is a lot different than children that went to a public school. But anyway, as I was saying, I think that education is very, very important in kind of shaping how a person ends up being in the future. And I really wanted to discuss, sorry, I lost my notes. First thing I wanted to talk about is that the ACT scores in Kansas City are actually very much lower than the national average. The national average, I do not have, but the Kansas City average was about a 16.5, and the highest score you can get on your ACT is a 36. So very, very low. They stated this in a couple of years ago. And so I was kind of more interested in figuring out a little bit more about not just education, but murder rates more. Because I've talked a lot about the causes, but I want to focus a little bit more on the murder rates themselves. So I actually reached out to my boss's husband. My boss's husband has been a cop for over 20 years, and he reported that he had been involved in more than 1,000 homicides in Kansas City in the past 20 years, kind of solving that out and trying to figure it out. And when I talked to him, I asked him, what do you think the main reason is for these murders? Like, what do you think is the cause for them? And he said, after 2 seconds, he said, education. These kids in these areas of poverty east of the highway are not receiving proper education. And because of this, they are selling drugs. And when you're involved in drugs, there's a lot of killing that happens. He actually did tell me that there's a lot of black on black crime. He sees a lot of black on black crime, and it usually has a lot to do with drugs. And he himself said, the question is, where are these people getting these drugs? And why are they resorting to selling drugs? The answer is the lack of education. You get a bunch of children together who already have a pretty rough home life, and then you give them schools that are not well kept and teachers who do not care enough to be teaching. And then when I asked Officer Johnson about the selling drugs and everything, I was like, well, how does that, correlate to homicides? And he actually explained it and said that when you're involved in selling drugs, a lot of times your parents and, gangs and stuff like that, your family gets involved. If you aren't paying someone back for something, they're going to kill your mother. And then when they kill your mother, you go kill their uncle. And it's just a chain reaction of that, and that's just how it ends up. And Officer Johnson himself said that education is very much the reason for all of this gang and drug related things happening that do oftentimes end up in homicides and murders. Now, I think that there are several solutions to fixing the education in Kansas City. One thing specifically I found we actually talked about in class, which was an article called Head Start. And Head Start actually began in 1965, and they started out helping 561,000 students, and since then they have helped millions more. And they help children between the ages of 3 to 5, and they are looking at children that just don't have the money and parents that don't have the money to be putting their children in preschool. Now, I personally think that this is a very helpful program, but there are, of course, problems to everything. Some of the problems of Head Start is that they only accept children between the ages of 3 to 5, and it is for preschool education. And a lot of people argue that children don't need preschool education. But I personally think that the sooner that a child is put in school, the more that they are are structured and able to kind of work in an environment with other people other than their parents. Now, I think that the only issue is that we as a country are focusing more on putting money and time into several different programs to help kids. We need to be focusing on major programs that are going to help a mass amount of students, that are really going to get things done. And I think that Head Start could really help kids out if they expanded their age, didn't just focus on preschool, but maybe even on helping kids with college or high schools, or just things, kind of helping them with supplies and things that they really, really need to help them get through school. And I think that they need to be focusing on Head Start, especially so that they can have more money, because I think I found that it costs around a little bit over $5,000 to aid each student in preschool. So if you're going to be helping many more kids, you're going to be needing a lot more money, and that is one of the issues there. But I think that if we do focus more of our time on more major programs, that we can be a lot more helpful. Now, I think that Kansas City is a beautiful city, and I think that there are so many opportunities. I just think that there are many things that are kind of making it a little bit more of an unsafe place to live, things like poverty and, gentrification that needs to be addressed. I think that child abuse is something that's always an issue that also needs to be addressed. And most importantly, I think that education is something that needs to be stressed on in Kansas City, because it has not been the best in the past, and because of that, you're going to have more crime. Thank you.